Hey now everybody, this is Professor Island, and today we're talking about formatting, and today we are specifically talking about paragraphing. When you write a paper for me, you're creating a formatted document that has a particular flow to it, and as part of that, there are three types of paragraphs you will be utilizing to create that logical flow. There are introductions, there are conclusions, and there are body paragraphs. There's only one introduction, and there's only one conclusion, and there are anywhere between 1 and 10 body paragraphs, depending on the length of your paper. Today I'm going to be discussing with you which one does what in the process so that you understand what I'm looking for in each type of paragraph. Let's start with introductions. An introduction, as the name implies, simply introduces your paper. It is not a laundry list of the specific points you're going to make. In fact, what it is going to do for you and what it's going to tell me is the overall point of your paper, which means, for example, if you're doing the first paper for English 101, you're going to tell me whether the work is interpretive, literary, or escapist commercial, but you're not going to give me a specific list of which characters are round or flat, or even mention character or mention conflict or any of those things. That will be part of the detail of the body of the essay. Likewise, for your English 103 papers, you're going to be using multiple critical perspectives to explain how a work is translated. I don't need a list of the critical perspectives as much as I need you to simply tell me that when multiple critical perspectives are applied, some general theme is revealed in the work. This statement, this thesis statement, is the last sentence of your introduction and really is the focal point. It tells me where you're going with your paper. Besides the thesis statement, I also want a background statement. And a background statement may be one, maybe two sentences in which you're simply going to give me something that starts the conversation. For example, you might give me a definition. Define the literary term. Define some aspect of the critical perspective that you may be using. Another thing is to give me a general statement of truth or belief. Perhaps the work you're analyzing is about the music business, or it's about drugs, or it's about homelessness, or something like that. Giving me a general statement, no secondary sources required here, just a general statement of truth. Something like, homelessness is a problem, or drug use affects many musicians, something like that to begin the conversation, and then with your thesis statement, you tell me where you're going specifically with that theme, and now you have your introduction. Introductions are at least 2 sentences, and they are no more than 4 or 5, because if you give me more than 4 or 5, you're doing one of several things. You're either giving me a list of everything you're going to talk about, which I don't want you to do. You're giving me specific details about what you want to talk about, which I definitely do not want you to do. Or you're wandering off topic, and I don't want you to do that either. In the same way, a conclusion paragraph is also fairly short. The first thing I'm going to see in a conclusion is very much like the last thing I see in an introduction. However, what you're going to do is you're going to take that thesis statement from the introduction and you're going to reword it as the summary of your overall paper. Again, it is not a list of things you just told me. In fact, it is not a statement, especially that says, as you can see, I've just talked about this stuff. Instead, you're simply going to restate the overall point. Clearly, Sherman Alexie's What You Pawn I Will Redeem is mostly escapist. Or clearly, when several critical perspectives are applied, Kurt Cobain's All Apologies reveals a tortured soul. This kind of generalized overall view tells the reader intuitively that you're done, that you are not going to give us any more detail, you're not going to examine any more specific ideas or concepts, and that you're wrapping things up. What follows the summary of your point in a conclusion is going to be the kind of generalized projection. And in classes like this, what the projection does is it takes the idea that you've discussed in your paper, whether it's a literary thematic point or it is a substantive literary point brought up by the work itself, and you're going to broaden it out. Something like, it's the use of these literary terms that helps people understand how works work. Or, it's works like these that make Kurt Cobain such an important figure. It's this kind of generalized thing where you take what you talked about and you make a more generalized point. But at that point, you're done. No lists, no details, no quotations in either the introduction or the conclusion. Give me at least 2 sentences in an introduction and a conclusion, and give me no more than 4 or 5. And that's all I want for the introduction and conclusion. Where the essence of your paper is, and which I'm largely grading you on, is what happens in the body paragraphs. And for something as short as a response, you're only going to give me 1 body paragraph. For your papers, and well, for your tests specifically, your tests will be 3 body paragraphs, and for your papers it may run anywhere between 3 to 7 or 8, depending on how long your paper is going to be. A body paragraph is an important element because it is the argument. This is where you give me specific detail. This is where you give me specific definitions. This is where you give me specific quotation. And if you look at the way that the body paragraph is constructed, you can see that I'm not looking for a single individual example, an individual point, as much as I'm looking for you to take an idea and to develop it as much as possible. For English 101, what I would like you to do on the first paper is you're going to analyze a character, for example. You're not just going to simply tell me one thing about that character. You're going to tell me many things about the character. You're going to be discussing whether they're round or flat in a general way, which would be your topic sentence for the paragraph. But within that argument, you're going to be giving me specific details about internal conflict, about complexity, about fundamental character change, and you're also going to be discussing for me the external conflicts. If you look at the way that the paragraph is going to be structured, your overall point, that topic sentence, will then be followed by a series of minor points, and those minor points will be those specific things that lead to the larger thing. So, if your topic sentence for that English 101 paper is such and such character is round, the next thing I want you to get to is this character's roundness comes from his complexity, and then you give me an example. You might give me a quotation. You might give me an explanation of that quotation, and then you wrap up that point and move on to the next minor point. This character is also round because they have internal conflict. Internal conflict are these two things. Here's a quotation from the story that demonstrates it. And the idea is you're building an argument within that paragraph, and when you get to the end of the paragraph, you will then restate the overall point, that topic sentence. As you can see, this character is mostly round. For English literature courses, you're analyzing things based on critical perspectives, and that critical perspective really is the focal point. But within that, you're examining various aspects of your primary source to explain how that critical perspective applies. And again, it's not just one thing, it's multiple things, and you're going to go through these elements of it. So, for example, if you're going to explore Diamonds and Rust by Joan Baez and look at it from a biographical perspective, you would go through the elements, and your topic sentence would be, from a biographical perspective, this is a story about the author and Bob Dylan. And then you'd go through the works. You'd say, to begin with, she describes Bob Dylan very specifically, and you'd give me a quotation from the primary source in which she said, you know, his eyes are blue and he looks all wild and all this kind of stuff. And then you'd find a secondary source that says something along the lines of, Bob Dylan at that time was known for this particular scruffy look, and it supports the claim you're making. And then you move on to the next minor point. She's also talking about herself, and then these other images that she brings up. And again, you're creating this argument using primary and secondary sources for each of the claims that you're making to create this argument. And by the end of that paragraph, then, you can see that biographical criticism is relevant to that particular work. For those doing the final paper for English 101, it's a similar construct to what you see for the English 103 paper. You will be taking a work and examining it in a much larger way, and a much more extended way, and as part of that you're using both primary and secondary text, this research, to support your arguments. So, for example, if you were going to cover Worn Path and you wanted to discuss the elements within the story, I don't want you to give me a paragraph on symbols, a paragraph on irony, and then a paragraph on conflict. Instead, I want you to take something like her discussion of the animals. She gives this big long list of, get out of my way, all you foxes and owls, and all this kind of stuff. And what you would do is you would introduce the paragraph by saying the animals in the story carry many symbolic and other literary elements. And you'd start by discussing the animals that she mentions, and in bringing up an animal, you would explain its symbolic nature, give me a quote from the story, give me a quote from a secondary source. Foxes are often associated with slyness and cunning and often are deceptive. And then you'd also show me where she comes across this character in human form in the story. And now you have a man versus man conflict. Of course, her against the fox is a man versus nature conflict. And then, of course, the irony of who outfoxes whom later on in the story. And now you're developing your argument in a way that the overall point is not to talk about all the symbols or all the conflicts or all the ironies, but rather how this thing has both symbol and irony and conflict embedded within it. And again, you're using the primary and secondary sources to create the minor points in your paragraph for that major point that basically says the animals are both symbolic and also carry with them other literary meaning. Keep in mind that for a lot of the material you do for me, I'm looking for a very concise, tight argument. I don't need a lot of narrative. I do not need you to retell me the story. Keep in mind that I've read these stories multiple times. What I'm looking for is your ability to explain your understanding of those literary meanings, and using this structure should help you to stay on point and give me the material I need, and also to create a cohesive series of arguments. Introduction, conclusion, body paragraphs. Keep them separate and your paper will be both logical and also easy to follow. Stay in touch.